Philip Miller stood frozen in the doorway of his apartment, watching Lionel King pack the last of his belongings into a cardboard box. The silence between them stretched like a chasm that had been widening for months, filled with all the words they had never said and all the touches that had lingered just a moment too long. Lionel's hands trembled slightly as he folded his favorite sweater. The blue one that Philip had always said brought out his eyes, and Philip felt something crack open in his chest like a fault line finally giving way to an earthquake. "So this is it then," Philip said, his voice barely above a whisper, and Lionel's shoulders tensed without him turning around. "This is it," Lionel replied, and Philip could hear the careful control in his voice. The way he was holding himself together with nothing but willpower and stubborn pride. Philip stepped into the room, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. They had picked out together 3 years ago when they first decided to be roommates. Back when everything was simple and uncomplicated. When Philip was still convinced he was straight and Lionel was just his best friend who happened to give the most incredible hugs and whose laugh could light up Philip's entire world. Lionel saw him, Philip said, and this time his friend did turn around, those familiar brown eyes meeting his with a mixture of pain and resignation that made Philip's heart twist in his chest. "Don't," Lionel said softly. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." But Philip couldn't stop himself from crossing the room, couldn't stop himself from reaching out to cup Lionel's face in his hands, the way he had wanted to do for months, but had never quite found the courage. Lionel's skin was warm beneath his palms, and Philip could feel the slight tremor that ran through his friend's body at the contact. "I love you," Philip whispered, the words falling from his lips like a confession that had been building for so long he had forgotten how to breathe without it. "I'm in love with you, and I have been for months, and I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out." Lionel's eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment Philip thought he might pull away, might finish packing and walk out of his life forever. But then Lionel's hands came up to cover Philip's, pressing them more firmly against his cheeks. And when he opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I love you too," Lionel breathed. "God, Philip, I love you so much it's been killing me." Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends found themselves standing on the precipice of something that would change everything, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Philip Miller had been absolutely certain of exactly three things. He was straight, Lionel King was his best friend, and the weird fluttery feeling he got in his stomach whenever Lionel hugged him was probably just indigestion from too much takeout pizza. These certainties had formed the foundation of his world for the past 2 years. Ever since he and Lionel had met in their sophomore literature class and bonded over their mutual love of obscure poetry, Philip had never questioned his sexuality before. He had dated women throughout high school and college, had even been in a serious relationship with Helen Hill for almost a year before they mutually decided they were better as friends. He knew what attraction felt like, knew the rush of desire and the anticipation of a first kiss. What he felt for Lionel was different, deeper somehow, like coming home after a long journey. It started with the hugs. Lionel had always been physically affectionate, the kind of person who expressed love through touch in a way that Philip had initially found overwhelming. Growing up in a household where emotions were kept carefully contained, Philip had been unprepared for Lionel's casual intimacy. The way he would throw an arm around Philip's shoulders while they walked across campus, or pull him into enthusiastic embraces whenever they reunited after being apart. But somewhere in the past few months, those hugs had started lasting longer. What used to be quick, friendly embraces had evolved into something else entirely. Moments where Lionel would hold Philip close, and neither of them seemed willing to be the first to let go. Philip would find himself breathing in the scent of Lionel's shampoo, something clean and woodsy that made him want to bury his face in the curve of Lionel's neck and never come up for air. The first time Philip noticed the change, they had been standing in the kitchen of their shared apartment after Lionel had returned from a weekend visit home. Philip had been making coffee, still groggy from sleep, when he heard the key in the lock and felt his entire body come alive with anticipation. Lionel had dropped his bag by the door and crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides, wrapping Philip in a hug that lifted him slightly off his feet. "Missed you," Lionel had murmured against Philip's ear, and the words had sent a shiver down Philip's spine that he had tried desperately to ignore. They had stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. Lionel's arms tight around Philip's waist, Philip's hands splayed across Lionel's back. When they finally separated, there had been something different in Lionel's expression, a softness around his eyes that Philip had never noticed before. "Coffee?" Philip had asked, his voice slightly hoarse, and Lionel had nodded, but his gaze had lingered on Philip's face for just a moment too long before he turned away. That had been the beginning, Philip realized now, the moment when their friendship had started shifting into something else, something neither of them had been brave enough to name. The hugs had continued to stretch longer, becoming moments of connection that left Philip feeling slightly breathless and confused. Lionel would find excuses to touch him throughout the day, a hand on his shoulder while they studied together, fingers brushing against his when they passed books back and forth. Philip had tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that the electricity he felt every time Lionel touched him was just his overactive imagination. He had even gone on a few dates with women from his classes, desperate to prove to himself that nothing had changed, that he was still the same person he had always been. It was during one of these dates, sitting across from Julie Brown at an expensive restaurant downtown, that Philip had realized he was in trouble. Julie was beautiful and smart and funny. Everything he should have wanted in a girlfriend. But as she talked about her plans for graduate school, all Philip could think about was how Lionel would have made him laugh by now, how Lionel's eyes lit up when he got excited about something. "Are you okay?" Julie had asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "You seem distracted." Philip had looked down at her manicured fingers against his skin and felt absolutely nothing. No spark, no warmth, no desire to lean closer or deepen the contact. Just the hollow ache of knowing he was in the wrong place with the wrong piston. "I'm sorry," he had said, pulling his hand away gently. "I think I need to go home." Julie had been understanding, and as he walked back to his apartment through the cool evening air, Philip had felt something loosening in his chest, like he was finally allowing himself to breathe after holding his breath for months. Lionel had been curled up on their couch when Philip walked in, wearing his favorite pair of sweatpants in one of Philip's old t-shirts that he had somehow claimed as his own. He was reading a book of poetry, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made Philip's fingers itch to brush it back. "How was your date?" Lionel had asked without looking up from his book, but Philip could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "It was fine," Philip had lied, sinking down onto the couch beside Lionel, close enough that their thighs were touching. "Julie's nice." "That's good," Lionel had said, and Philip could hear the careful neutrality in his voice. They had sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft whisper of pages turning. Philip had found himself watching Lionel read, studying the curve of his profile, the way his lips moved slightly as he processed the words. It had felt like looking at a piece of art, something beautiful and precious that he wanted to memorize. "Philip," Lionel had said softly, and Philip had realized he had been staring. "Yeah? Are you happy?" The question had caught Philip off guard, simple and direct in a way that cut through all his careful defenses. He had opened his mouth to give the automatic response, but looking into Lionel's concerned brown eyes, he had found himself unable to lie. "I don't know," he had admitted. "I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not, but I don't know who I actually am." Lionel had closed his book and turned to face Philip fully. "What do you mean?" Philip had struggled to find the words. "It's like I'm going through the motions of my life, but nothing feels real anymore. I go on dates and I feel nothing. I don't know what's wrong with me." "There's nothing wrong with you," Lionel had said firmly, reaching out to take Philip's hand. "Maybe you're just figuring out what you actually want instead of what you think you're supposed to want." The touch of Lionel's fingers against his had sent that familiar jolt of electricity through Philip's system, and he had found himself looking down at their joined hands with a mixture of wonder and terror. "What if what I want is something I never thought I could have?" Philip had asked quietly, not daring to look up from their hands. "Then maybe it's time to stop thinking and start feeling," Lionel had replied. And when Philip had finally raised his eyes, he had found Lionel watching him with an expression so tender and understanding that it had taken his breath away. They had stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked, balanced on the edge of something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. But before either of them could move, Lionel's phone had buzzed with a text message, breaking the spell. "I should probably get some sleep," Lionel had said, his voice slightly unsteady. "Early class tomorrow." That night, Philip had lain awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their conversation. And slowly, like dawn breaking over the horizon, the truth had begun to take shape in his mind. He wasn't broken or confused. He was in love. He was in love with his best friend, and everything he thought he knew about himself was crumbling around him like a house of cards. The realization should have been terrifying, and part of it was. Philip had never questioned his sexuality before, had never even considered the possibility that he might be attracted to men. But as he lay there in the darkness, thinking about Lionel's smile and the way his laugh made Philip's chest feel warm and light, it didn't feel like a revelation so much as an acknowledgement of something he had always known but had never allowed himself to see. The next few weeks had been a special kind of torture. Philip had found himself hyper-aware of every interaction with Lionel, cataloging each smile, each casual touch, each moment of eye contact like he was gathering evidence for a case he was too afraid to make. But Philip had also noticed other things that made his stomach clench with jealousy, like the way Lionel had started going out more, accepting invitations to parties and social gatherings that he had previously declined. Like the way he had started mentioning other people in his conversations, names that Philip didn't recognize. The worst part had been the night Lionel had come home from one of these social outings with lipstick on his collar and a guilty expression that he had tried to hide behind forced cheerfulness. Philip had felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest at the sight. "Good night?" Philip had asked, trying to keep his voice light and failing miserably. "It was okay," Lionel had said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Just drinks with some people from my Victorian literature class." Philip had nodded and made some appropriate response, but inside he had been screaming. He had wanted to ask who had kissed Lionel, wanted to know if it had meant anything, wanted to demand to know why Lionel was looking for something with other people when Philip was right there, loving him with every fiber of his being. The pattern had continued for weeks. Lionel would go out, sometimes coming home with evidence of romantic encounters, sometimes just coming home distant and distracted. Philip had felt like he was watching the person he loved slip away from him, and the worst part was that he had no right to try to stop it. But then something had shifted. It had started with small things, Lionel declining invitations he would have accepted before, spending more evenings at home, seeming restless and unsatisfied. The casual mentions of other people had stopped, replaced by a kind of thoughtful silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. And the hugs had started again, longer than ever, filled with a desperate quality that made Philip's heart race. Lionel would hold him like he was afraid Philip might disappear, his face buried in Philip's shoulder, his breathing slightly uneven. It had all come to a head on a rainy Thursday evening in early November. Philip had been grading papers at the kitchen table when Lionel had come home from his shift at the bookstore, soaked from the sudden downpour and looking more defeated than Philip had ever seen him. Without a word, Lionel had dropped his bag by the door and crossed to where Philip was sitting, pulling him up from his chair and into an embrace that felt like coming home and falling apart all at once. "I can't do this anymore," Lionel had whispered against Philip's neck, his voice broken and raw. "Do what?" Philip had asked, even though he thought he knew. "Pretend," Lionel had said simply. "Pretend that what I feel for you is just friendship. Pretend that I don't think about you every minute of every day. Pretend that kissing other people doesn't feel like betraying the only person who matters to me." Philip had pulled back to look at Lionel's face, searching his expression for any sign that he was misunderstanding. But Lionel's eyes had been bright with unshed tears, his face open and vulnerable. "Lionel," Philip had breathed, reaching up to cup his friend's face in his hands. "I know you're straight," Lionel had rushed on, as if he needed to get all the words out before he lost his courage. "I know this probably ruins everything between us, and I'm sorry, but I can't keep pretending anymore. I'm in love with you, Philip. I've been in love with you for months, and it's killing me. For a moment, Philip had been too stunned to respond. All the weeks of wondering and hoping and fearing had led to this moment, and now that it was here, he felt like his brain had short-circuited. Lionel loved him. Lionel was in love with him. "You think I'm straight?" Philip had finally managed to say, and something like hope had flickered in Lionel's eyes. "Aren't you?" Philip had laughed, a sound that was half relief and half hysteria. "I thought I was. I was so sure I was. But then you came into my life and turned everything upside down. And now I don't know anything except that I'm completely, hopelessly in love with you too." The transformation in Lionel's expression had been like watching the sun come out after a storm. The fear and resignation had melted away, replaced by something so bright and joyful that Philip had felt his own face split into a grin. "Really?" Lionel had asked, his voice small and hopeful. "Really," Philip had confirmed. "I've been going crazy trying to figure out what was wrong with me, why nothing felt right anymore. But it wasn't that something was wrong, it was just that I was trying to be someone I'm not." "And who are you?" Lionel had asked softly. "I'm someone who's in love with his best friend," Philip had said. "Someone who wants to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. Someone who wants to kiss you until we both forget our own names." "Then what are you waiting for?" Lionel had whispered. Philip hadn't needed to be asked twice. He had leaned forward and pressed his lips to Lionel's in a kiss that had been everything he had imagined and nothing like he had expected all at once. Lionel's lips had been soft and warm, and he had tasted like coffee and possibility. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Philip had rested his forehead against Lionel's and tried to process the fact that this was real, that this was actually happening. "Wow," Lionel had breathed, his eyes still closed. "Yeah," Philip had agreed. "Wow." They had stood there for a long moment, just breathing each other's air, letting the magnitude of what had just happened settle between them. Philip had felt like his entire world had shifted in on its axis. "So what happens now?" Lionel had asked eventually. "Now we figure it out together," Philip had said, pressing a soft kiss to Lionel's forehead. "We take it one day at a time and see where this leads us." "I'm scared," Lionel had admitted. "What if we mess this up? What if we ruin our friendship?" "Then we'll fix it," Philip had said firmly. "But I don't think we will. I think this is what we were always supposed to be. We just needed time to figure it out." Lionel had smiled at that, the kind of smile that lit up his entire face and made Philip's heart skip a beat. "I love you," he had said, like he was testing out the words now that he was allowed to say them. "I love you too," Philip had replied, and the words had felt like coming home. That night they had talked until dawn, curled up together on the couch with Lionel's head on Philip's shoulder and Philip's fingers running through his hair. They had talked about everything, their fears, their hopes, the moments when they had each realized their feelings were more than friendship. As the sun had started to rise, painting their living room in shades of gold and pink, Philip had felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time in so long, everything felt right. The person he loved was in his arms, and the future stretched out before them full of possibility. But of course, it hadn't been that simple. The next few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions as they had navigated their new relationship. There had been moments of pure joy, like their first official date to the little cafe where they had spent so many afternoons as friends, or the first time Lionel had fallen asleep in Philip's bed. But there had also been moments of doubt and fear. Philip had struggled with questions about his sexuality, wondering if he was gay or bisexual or something else entirely. He had worried about what his family would think, what his friends would say. Lionel had been patient with him through all of it, never pushing, always ready to talk through Philip's fears and insecurities. He had shared his own struggles too, his worry that Philip might decide this was all a mistake. "What if this is just a phase?" Philip had asked one night. "Then we'll deal with it," Lionel had said simply. "But Philip, the way you look at me, the way you touch me, the way you kiss me, that's not a phase. That's love." Those words had settled something in Philip's chest, had quieted the voice in his head that kept insisting this was all too good to be true. Because Lionel was right. This did feel like coming home. The turning point had come about a month into their relationship. Philip had been having coffee with his friend, George Davis, who had noticed that Philip seemed different, happier somehow. When George had asked what was going on, Philip had found himself at a crossroads. "I'm seeing someone," Philip had said, his heart pounding. "That's great," George had said enthusiastically. "Anyone I know? What's she like?" Philip had taken a deep breath. "Actually, it's Lionel." George had blinked, clearly processing this information. "Lionel? Your roommate Lionel?" "Yeah." There had been a moment of silence, but then George had smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Well, that explains why you've been so happy lately," George had said. "You two have been crazy about each other for ages. I was wondering when you'd figure it out." That conversation had been the first of many. Philip had slowly started coming out to his friends and family, each conversation getting a little easier as he realized that the people who mattered most just wanted him to be happy. As winter had turned to spring, their relationship had deepened and strengthened. They had learned each other's bodies and hearts, had navigated the transition from friends to lovers with a grace that had surprised them both. They had fought occasionally, usually about small things, but they had always talked through their disagreements with honesty and respect. The physical aspect of their relationship had been a revelation for Philip. He had been nervous at first, unsure of himself. But Lionel had been patient and gentle, guiding Philip through the discovery of what it meant to love someone with his whole body as well as his heart. But it hadn't been just about the physical intimacy. It had been about the emotional connection too, the way they could communicate without words, the way they seemed to understand each other on a level that Philip had never experienced before, which was what made the fight so devastating when it finally came. It had started over something stupid, a misunderstanding about plans for the weekend that had spiraled into something much bigger. Philip had been stressed about his upcoming finals, and Lionel had been dealing with pressure from his family about his post-graduation plans. They had both been on edge, and when the argument had finally erupted, it had been like a dam bursting. "Maybe this was a mistake," Philip had said in the heat of the moment, the words flying out of his mouth before he could stop them. "Maybe we were better off as friends." The look on Lionel's face had been like a punch to the gut. All the color had drained from his cheeks, and his eyes had gone wide with hurt and shock. "Is that really what you think?" Lionel had asked quietly. Philip had wanted to take it back immediately, but his pride had gotten in the way, and instead of apologizing, he had doubled down. "I don't know," he had said. "Maybe it is." Lionel had nodded slowly. "Okay," he had said simply. "If that's how you feel, then maybe I should move out." "Maybe you should," Philip had replied, and even as the words left his mouth, he had known he was making a terrible mistake. Lionel had left that night, and Philip had spent the next 3 days in a haze of regret and self-loathing. The apartment had felt empty without Lionel's presence, like all the life had been sucked out of it. By the fourth day, Philip had been desperate. He had called and texted, but Lionel hadn't responded. It had been Helen Hill, of all people, who had finally talked sense into him. Philip had run into her at the campus library, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "You look terrible," she had said bluntly. "What happened with Lionel?" Philip had spilled everything. "Do you love him?" "More than anything." "Then stop being an idiot and go fight for him," Helen had said. "Pride is a cold bedfellow, Philip." Her words had been the kick in the pants Philip had needed. He had gone to the bookstore where Lionel worked, had waited until his shift was over, and had intercepted him in the parking lot. "I'm an idiot," Philip had said without preamble. "I'm a scared, stupid idiot who said things I didn't mean because I was afraid of how much I love you." Lionel had crossed his arms over his chest, his expression guarded. "Philip?" "No, let me finish," Philip had rushed on. "I know I hurt you, but I need you to know that what I said about us being a mistake, that was just fear talking. You are not a mistake. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." "Why should I believe you, Bondabench?" Lionel had asked. "Because I'm here," Philip had said simply. "Because I love you, Lionel, and I'm ready to prove it to you every single day for the rest of our lives, if that's what it takes." That had been the moment when Lionel's defenses had finally crumbled. He had crossed the distance between them and had thrown himself into Philip's arms. "I missed you so much," Lionel had whispered against Philip's neck. "I missed you too," Philip had replied. "I'm so sorry I hurt you." "Just don't do it again," Lionel had said. "I can forgive you for being scared, but I can't forgive you for giving up on us. Never again, Philip had promised. They had gone home together that night, and for the first time in almost a week, Philip had felt like he could breathe again. They had talked for hours, working through the hurt and fear, establishing boundaries for how they would handle conflicts in the future. The months that followed had been the happiest of Philip's life. He and Lionel had grown closer than ever, their relationship strengthened by having survived their first real test. They had graduated together, had found an apartment in the city, had started building a life that felt permanent and real. But most importantly, Philip had learned to trust in what he and Lionel had together. The love between them had only grown stronger with time, deepening into something that felt unshakable. Which was why, when Lionel had started acting distant and withdrawn a few weeks ago, Philip had been completely blindsided. At first, he had tried to tell himself it was just stress from work. But as the days had turned into weeks and Lionel had continued to pull away, Philip had started to panic. Lionel had been spending more time away from their apartment, staying late at work or going out with friends. When they were home together, he had been distracted and quiet, avoiding physical contact in a way that had made Philip's stomach twist with anxiety. The worst part had been the way Lionel had stopped initiating their usual displays of affection. No more surprise hugs, no more casual touches while they cooked dinner together. No more sleepy kisses, good morning. Philip had tried to bring it up several times, but Lionel had brushed off his concerns, insisting that everything was fine. But Philip could see the loan in his eyes, could feel the distance growing between them. The breaking point had come when Philip had found the apartment listings. He had been looking for his phone charger in Lionel's desk drawer when he had come across the printed pages, listings for studio apartments and one-bedrooms in their neighborhood. The sight of them had hit him like a physical blow. That was when Philip had confronted him, when they had finally had the conversation that had been building for weeks. And that was when Lionel had admitted the truth, that he had been thinking about moving out, that he wasn't sure their relationship was working anymore. I love you, Lionel had said, his voice breaking. I will always love you. But I don't think love is enough anymore. What do you mean, Philip had asked. I mean that we want different things, Lionel had explained. You want security and stability, and I want adventure and change and the freedom to figure out who I am without being half of a couple all the time. Since when? Philip had demanded. A month ago you were talking about us getting a dog. Lionel had flinched. Maybe that was the problem, he had said quietly. Maybe I was getting caught up in the fantasy instead of thinking about what I actually wanted. And what you actually want is to leave me? What I actually want, men, to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by my relationship with you, Lionel had said. I've been with you for almost 2 years, Philip. Before that, I was trying so hard to be straight that I never really explored what it meant to be gay. I feel like I skipped a whole phase of my life. The words had cut through Philip like a knife. He had understood what Lionel was really saying, that he wanted to date other people, to explore his sexuality with partners who weren't Philip. So this is it then, Philip had said, his voice hollow. You're breaking up with me so you can go sleep around and figure yourself out. It's not about sleeping around, Lionel had protested. It's about knowing who I am as an individual before I commit to spending my life with someone else. And you can't figure that out while being with me? No, Lionel had said simply, I can't. Because when I'm with you, all I want is to make you happy. I lose myself in trying to be the person you need me to be. That had been the moment when Philip's heart had truly broken, because he could see the truth in Lionel's eyes, could understand, even as it destroyed him, that Lionel genuinely believed what he was saying. So what happens now, Philip had asked. Now I move out, Lionel had said, and we both take some time to figure out what we really want. And what if what I really want is you? Lionel had looked at him with such sadness. Then maybe someday, when we've both had time to grow and change, we can find our way back to each other. But right now, I need to go. Which was how Philip had ended up standing in the doorway of their bedroom, watching the person he loved pack up his life and prepare to walk away. The last few days had been a blur of boxes and awkward conversations, of dividing up possessions and trying to figure out the logistics of separating a life they had built together. Philip had tried to be mature about it, had tried to respect Lionel's decision even as it tore him apart. But inside, he had been screaming, begging, pleading for Lionel to change his mind. "I think that's everything," Lionel said, taping up the last box and setting it with the others by the door. Philip nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had used up all his words over the past few days, had said everything he could think of to try to change Lionel's mind. Lionel picked up his suitcase and slung his messenger bag over his shoulder, then turned to face Philip one last time. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Philip could see that this was as hard for him as it was for Philip. "I'm sorry," Lionel said quietly. "I know this isn't what either of us wanted." "But it's what you need," Philip replied. "Yeah," Lionel agreed. "It's what I need." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other across the distance that had grown between them, and Philip memorized everything. The way Lionel's hair fell across his forehead, the small scar on his chin, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "Take care of yourself," Lionel said. "You too," Philip managed. Lionel hesitated for a moment, like he was going to say something else, but then he just nodded and headed for the door. Philip followed him, watching as Lionel loaded his boxes into his car. When everything was packed, Lionel turned back to Philip one last time. For a moment, Philip thought he might change his mind, but instead, Lionel just gave him a small, sad smile and got into his car. Philip stood in the doorway and watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner, taking the love of his life away from him. The apartment felt like a tomb when Philip finally went back inside. Every room held memories that now felt like ghosts. Philip walked through the space they had shared, touching the places where Lionel's presence had left its mark. He ended up in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the mattress and staring at the empty space where Lionel's nightstand used to be. For the first time since this whole nightmare had started, Philip allowed himself to cry. When Philip woke up the next morning, for just a moment, he forgot. He reached across the bed for Lionel's warmth, expecting to find him there. But his hand found only cold sheets, an empty space, and the reality crashed over him like a wave. Lionel was gone. The days that followed were some of the darkest of Philip's life. He went through the motions of his routine, but inside he felt hollow. His friends tried to help, but Philip wasn't ready for their advice or their attempts to set him up with other people. Weeks turned into months, and slowly Philip began to build a new routine. He redecorated the apartment, removing the painful reminders. He threw himself into work, started going to therapy, talking through his feelings with a counselor who helped him understand that loving someone sometimes meant letting them go. But even as Philip learned to function without Lionel, he never stopped hoping. He never stopped believing that somehow, someday, they would find their way back to each other. It was 6 months after Lionel had moved out when Philip saw him again. Philip had been grocery shopping when he had looked up and seen a familiar figure examining the apples. For a moment, Philip's heart had stopped. Lionel looked different somehow, thinner maybe, with longer hair, but it was definitely him. Philip had debated whether to approach him, but a larger part of him needed to know how Lionel was doing. "Lionel," Philip had called softly, and Lionel had turned, his eyes widening with surprise. "Philip," Lionel had said. They had talked for almost an hour, standing there in the grocery store. Lionel had told him about his new apartment, his new job, the pottery classes he had started taking. Philip had shared updates about work, about the book he was trying to write. But underneath the surface conversation, Philip could see something in Lionel's eyes, a sadness that matched his own. Despite all the new experiences, he didn't look like someone who had found what he was looking for. "Are you happy?" Philip had asked finally. Lionel had been quiet for a long moment. "I'm learning things about myself," he had said. "I'm growing and changing. But happy, I don't know if I remember what that feels like anymore." The admission had given Philip hope, even as it broke his heart to see Lionel struggling. But Philip had forced himself to be patient. He had told Lionel he was glad they had run into each other, had said he hoped Lionel found what he was looking for, and had walked away without pushing for more. That encounter had given Philip something he hadn't had in months. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone who couldn't let go, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who believed that true love always found a way. And then, 3 weeks ago, Lionel had called. Philip had been making dinner when his phone had rung, and he had almost dropped his knife when he saw Lionel's name on the screen. They hadn't spoken since that day in the grocery store. "Hello," he had said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Philip," Lionel had said, and Philip could hear something different in his voice, something vulnerable. "I'm not good, Philip. I'm really not good." The pain in Lionel's voice had cut through Philip like a knife. "What's wrong?" he had asked. "Are you hurt?" "No, nothing like that," Lionel had said quickly. "It's just, I think I made a mistake, Philip. I think I made a huge mistake, and I don't know how to fix it." Philip's heart had started racing. "What kind of mistake?" "Leaving you, Lionel had whispered. "Leaving us. I thought I needed to figure out who I was on my own, but all I've figured out is that I'm miserable without you. I've dated other people, I've tried new things, and none of it matters because you're not there to share it with me." Philip had closed his eyes, gripping the phone tightly. "Lionel, I know I have no right to call you," Lionel had rushed on. "I know I hurt you, but I had to tell you. I had to tell you that I love you, that I never stopped loving you, and that leaving you was the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life." For a moment, Philip hadn't been able to speak. "Are you sure?" he had finally managed. "Are you sure this isn't just loneliness talking?" "I'm sure," Lionel had said firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Philip. I want to come home to you, if you'll have me back." Philip had started crying then, tears of relief and joy. "Of course I'll have you back," he had said through his tears. "God, Lionel, I never stopped waiting for you to come home." "Really?" Lionel had asked. "Really," Philip had confirmed. "I love you too. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." They had talked for hours that night, working through the hurt and the fear and the questions about what came next. But they had also agreed to take things slowly. Too much had happened for them to just pick up where they left off. So they had started with coffee dates, tentative meetings where they could talk and reconnect. Philip had been nervous before their first meeting, but the moment he had seen Lionel waiting for him at their old cafe, all his anxiety had melted away. Lionel had looked like himself again. The haunted sadness Philip had seen in the grocery store was gone, replaced by something softer and more hopeful. They had talked about everything, what Lionel had learned about himself during their time apart, how Philip had grown and changed, what they both wanted from a relationship now. Lionel had been honest about his experiences with other people, admitting that while he had learned things about his sexuality, none of his other relationships had come close to what he and Philip had shared. "I kept comparing everyone to you," Lionel had confessed, "and they all came up short. They didn't know how I like my coffee or that I can't sleep without white noise. They didn't laugh at my terrible jokes or remember my favorite poems or make me feel like I was home just by being in the same room." Philip had reached across the table to take Lionel's hand. "I missed you so much," he had said. "Every single day, I missed you." "I missed you too," Lionel had replied. "I thought I needed adventure and excitement, but what I really needed was you. I just had to figure that out the hard way." Their reconciliation had been gradual but steady. Coffee dates had turned into dinner dates, which had turned into long walks and movie nights. They had rediscovered each other slowly, carefully. The physical aspect of their relationship had been the most cautious to return. They had started with hand-holding, then brief kisses, then longer embraces. But they had agreed to wait, to make sure their emotional connection was solid before they added physical intimacy back into the mix. It had been worth the wait. When they had finally made love again, it had been like coming home after a long journey. Every touch had been reverent. Every kiss had been a promise. That had been 2 weeks ago, and since then, they had been practically inseparable. Lionel had been spending more and more time at Philip's apartment, leaving clothes in the dresser and toiletries in the bathroom, like he was slowly moving back in. But this morning, when Philip had woken up to find Lionel packing his things again, all his old fears had come rushing back. "What are you doing?" Fedalem had asked from the doorway, his voice tight with fear. Lionel had looked up, startled. "I'm just packing some things to take back to my place," he had said carefully. "I need to do laundry and pick up my mail." "Are you coming back?" Philip had asked, hating how desperate he sounded. "Of course I'm coming back," Lionel had said, crossing the room to take Philip in his arms. Philip, what's wrong? You look terrified. Philip had buried his face in Lionel's shoulder. I'm sorry, he had said. It's just that the last time I watched you pack, you didn't come back for 8 months. Seeing you with that bag just made me panic. Lionel had held him tighter. Hey, he had said softly, look at me. Philip had pulled back to meet Lionel's eyes, seeing nothing but love and understanding there. I'm never leaving you again, Lionel had said firmly. Never. What we have is too precious to throw away. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'm never forgetting it. Promise me, Philip had whispered. I promise, Lionel had said, cupping Philip's face in his hands. I promise you that I am done running. I promise you that this is where I want to be, where I choose to be for the rest of my life. And I promise you that the next time I pack a bag, it will be because we're moving in together officially. Philip had felt the last of his fear melt away at those words, replaced by a love so overwhelming it had taken his breath away. I love you, he had said. I love you too, Lionel had replied, more than I ever thought possible. And that was when Philip had realized that this was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he was absolutely certain that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with this man. Marry me, Bire, Philip had said suddenly, the words falling from his lips without conscious thought. Lionel had gone very still, his eyes widening with surprise. What? Marry me, Philip had repeated, more certain now. I know we're still figuring things out, but I also know that I want to spend my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want everything, Lionel. I want it all with you. Lionel had stared at him for a long moment, and Philip had held his breath, waiting for an answer. When Lionel finally spoke, his voice had been thick with emotion. Yes, he had whispered. Yes, of course, yes. And then they had been kissing, desperate and joyful and full of promises for the future. Philip had felt like his heart might burst with happiness, like all the pain and loneliness of the past 8 months had been worth it to get to this moment. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Lionel had rested his forehead against Philip's and smiled the kind of smile that lit up his entire face. So I guess I should probably move back in officially, Lionel had said, and Philip had laughed, the sound bright and joyful. I guess you should, Philip had agreed. Welcome home. And as they had stood there in their bedroom, surrounded by the promise of their shared future, Philip had known with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together forever and finally home.